In the summer of 1943, the largest tank battle in human history erupted on the vast plains near the Soviet city of Kursk. It was known as the Battle of Kursk, a clash that would decide the fate of the Eastern Front. Over 6,000 tanks from both sides, the German Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army, thundered into battle. Engines roared, cannons blazed, and the sky was filled with smoke and fire. The Germans launched their massive counteroffensive, codenamed Operation Citadel. Their goal: to crush the Soviet defenses and regain the initiative after the defeat at Stalingrad. But the Soviets were ready. They had built deep defensive lines, laid millions of mines, and prepared countless anti-tank traps. As the German Tiger and Panther tanks advanced, they met fierce resistance from Soviet T-34s and dug-in artillery. For days, the battle raged across the fields of Kursk. Tanks collided in brutal close combat. Soldiers fought for every me in the summer of 1943. The thunder of war echoed across the vast plains of western Russia. The Battle of Kursk was about to begin, the largest tank battle in human history. After their defeat at Stalingrad, the German army was determined to strike back. Their plan was bold, a massive offensive known as Operation Citadel. Their target: the Soviet stronghold around the city of Kursk. Capturing it would cut off Soviet forces and restore German dominance on the Eastern Front. But the Soviets knew what was coming. Thanks to their intelligence network, they had learned of Hitler's plan months before. In response, they prepared one of the most formidable defenses ever built. Hundreds of miles of trenches, millions of mines, and layers of anti-tank obstacles stretching across the landscape. When the German attack began in early July, more than 6,000 tanks and assault guns rolled into battle. The roar of engines shook the earth. The mighty Tiger and Panther tanks led the German advance, confident in their armor and firepower. Facing them, the Soviet Red Army deployed thousands of T-34 tanks, fast, reliable, and ready for the brutal test ahead. The fighting was fierce. Every hill, every village, every trench turned into a fortress. The skies above were filled with aircraft, dogfighting in deadly duels, while below, tanks clashed in close combat, cannon to cannon, steel against steel. At Prokhorovka, one of the most intense moments of the battle unfolded. Hundreds of tanks charged toward each other in a chaotic, fiery melee. It was a scene of destruction unlike anything the world had ever seen. A storm of metal and fire that symbolized the desperate struggle of both sides. But the German offensive soon stalled. Their forces were worn down by Soviet resistance, mechanical breakdowns, and relentless counterattacks. The Red Army struck back, launching its own offensive that drove the Germans into retreat. By the end of the battle, the fields of Kursk were littered with the wreckage of thousands of tanks. The German dream of victory in the East was shattered forever. The Red Army had not only survived, it had seized the momentum. From Kursk onward, the Soviets would push relentlessly westward, all the way to Berlin. The Battle of Kursk was more than just a clash of machines. It was a turning point in World War II, a moment when the tide of history shifted, and the balance of power changed forever. Eater of ground, and the earth trembled under the fury of steel. In the end, the German offensive was halted. The Red Army counterattacked, pushing the invaders back and turning the tide of the war for good. The Battle of Kursk marked the end of Germany's ability to launch major offensives on the Eastern Front. From that moment on, the Soviet forces began their unstoppable march toward Berlin. It was not just a battle of tanks. It was a battle that changed the course of World War. In the summer of 1943, the earth shook beneath the thunder of war. Across the rolling fields near the Soviet city of Kursk, two of the greatest armies in history faced each other in what would become the largest tank battle the world had ever seen. The German Wehrmacht, still reeling from defeat at Stalingrad, launched a massive counteroffensive. Its name, Operation Citadel. Hitler's goal was clear: crush the Soviet forces in the Kursk region, destroy their armies, and regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. But the Soviets were ready. Months of intelligence and preparation had revealed the German plan long before it began. The Red Army built layer after layer of defense, trenches, bunkers, and minefields stretching for hundreds of miles. More than 1 million soldiers stood ready, supported by thousands of tanks and guns. On July 5, 1943, the German attack began. Over 6,000 tanks and assault guns roared into motion. The ground trembled as the powerful Tiger and Panther tanks advanced, cutting through the morning fog. From the Soviet lines, waves of T-34s surged forward to meet them. What followed was a storm of steel. Shells screamed through the air. Explosions tore the fields apart. The sky was filled with smoke, fire, and the cries of engines pushed to their limits. At Prokhorovka, the battle reached its brutal peak. Hundreds of tanks collided in close combat, firing at point-blank range. There was no time to aim, no place to hide, just chaos, courage, and destruction. For days, the fighting raged on. The Germans fought fiercely, but their advance slowed. Soviet defenses held strong, reinforced by endless reserves and the unbreakable will of their soldiers. Operation Citadel was failing. When the Soviets launched their counterattack, the tide of war turned forever. The Germans were forced to retreat, leaving behind fields of burning wreckage, a graveyard of tanks, men, and lost ambitions. The Battle of Kursk marked the end of Germany's ability to wage large-scale offensives in the east. From that moment on, the Red Army began its unstoppable march toward Berlin. Kursk was not just a battle of machines. It was a battle of will, sacrifice, and destiny. It was the day when the Soviet Union turned defense into victory and changed the course of World War II forever. The Russian steppe in July 1943, a landscape of endless green and gold, where rolling fields stretched to the horizon beneath a blazing summer sun. But beneath that calm beauty, something immense was building. The air itself seemed to hum with tension, the kind that comes before a storm. Across those open plains, two of the greatest armies in history were preparing for a clash that would decide the fate of the Eastern Front. Thousands of tanks, millions of men, and an ocean of steel stood ready. The Germans called it Operation Citadel, their desperate bid to turn the tide of war. To the north and south of the city of Kursk, their armored divisions waited, engines growling, tracks biting into the soil. Facing them, the Soviet Red Army, hardened, relentless, and determined never to yield again. When the battle began, it was as if the earth itself erupted. The roar of engines, the thunder of guns, and the cries of soldiers merged into one vast storm of fire and iron. The largest tank battle in human history had begun. This was Kursk, 1943, a battle not just for territory, but for the future of a continent. At dawn on July 5, 1943, The silence of the Russian steppe was shattered. The German artillery opened up with a deafening barrage, pounding Soviet defenses in a massive storm of fire. Operation Citadel had begun. From the north came Field Marshal Model's Ninth Army. From the south, General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. Their goal was to cut through the Kursk salient, to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces inside. It was meant to be a lightning strike. Fast, decisive, unstoppable. But this time the Red Army was ready. For weeks, Soviet intelligence had known the attack was coming. Across the front, they built layer upon layer of defenses, minefields, trenches, and anti-tank gun lines stretching for hundreds of kilometers. As the German panzers rolled forward, they met a wall of resistance unlike anything they had ever seen. Tigers and Panthers clashed with T-34s in a brutal, close-range duel of steel and fire. The air above was filled with the roar of engines and the screams of dive bombers. Hour after hour the battle raged. The ground shook beneath the weight of thousands of tanks. The fields of Kursk, once calm and golden, were now torn apart by explosions, littered with burning wrecks and the scars of war. This was no longer blitzkrieg. This was a war of endurance, a test of will, strength, and sacrifice. July 5, 1943. The calm of dawn was broken by thunder. From horizon to horizon, German guns opened fire, shaking the earth for miles. Operation Citadel had begun, Hitler's last great gamble on the Eastern Front. Columns of tanks moved forward, their steel tracks grinding through the dust. Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinands advanced in perfect formation, confident that their power would crush the Soviet lines. Behind them, waves of infantry followed, and in the skies above, Luftwaffe bombers screamed downward in deadly precision strikes. But this time, the Soviets were waiting. For months they had built deep defenses, minefields, bunkers, and anti-tank traps. Stalin's commanders, Zhukov and Rokossovsky, had turned the Kursk salient into a fortress. When the German assault struck, it met a wall of fire. Mines exploded beneath tanks, artillery shells rained from hidden batteries, and Soviet soldiers held their ground with fierce determination. The fields of Kursk became a furnace, metal clashing, engines roaring, the sky black with smoke. The once peaceful steppe was now the stage for the largest tank battle in human history. And as the fighting raged, both sides knew whoever won at Kursk would shape the future of the war. The Russian steppe in July 1943. Endless waves of green and gold beneath a blazing summer sky. The wind moved softly through the tall grass, whispering across the land. But beneath that calm, something enormous was stirring. Deep underground, Soviet soldiers waited in their trenches, listening for the distant rumble of engines. Far to the west, German divisions assembled in silence, thousands of tanks, guns, and troops ready for one final push. Hitler called it Operation Citadel, a strike meant to crush the Red Army and turn the tide of war back in Germany's favor. But Stalin and his generals had been watching, waiting. They knew the attack was coming. For weeks, Soviet engineers built massive defenses, barbed wire, minefields, and anti-tank ditches stretching hundreds of kilometers. It was the most fortified battlefield the world had ever seen. As the sun rose on the morning of July 5, 1943, both armies stood ready. The air was heavy with heat and with destiny. The largest tank battle in human history was about to begin. The Russian steppe in July 1943, a sea of green and gold, stretching endlessly beneath a burning sun. The air shimmered with heat, and the wind carried only the whisper of grass. Yet beneath that calm beauty the world was holding its breath. All across the plains near the city of Kursk, two mighty forces gathered. To the west, the German Wehrmacht, rebuilt, rearmed, and ready to strike one last devastating blow. To the east, the Soviet Red Army, hardened by years of war, dug deep and waiting for the storm they knew was coming. For weeks, Soviet soldiers had toiled under the scorching sun, laying mines, building trenches, and preparing defenses. They knew the Germans would come, and when they did, it would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. The fields were calm, but beneath that calm lay the tension of history about to be written in fire and steel. This was the calm before the storm. The steppe waited, and soon the thunder of engines would awaken it. July 5, 1943. Dawn broke over the Russian steppe, and with it came the roar of war. The silence shattered as thousands of German guns opened fire, pounding the Soviet lines in a storm of fire and steel. Operation Citadel, the great German offensive, had begun. From the north, Field Marshal Model's division surged forward. From the south, General Hoth's armored columns advanced with hundreds of tanks, Tigers, Panthers, and the massive Ferdinands, their engines growling like beasts of war. Dust rose into the morning sky as the German war machine rolled toward Kursk. But the Red Army was ready. Soviet intelligence had uncovered every detail of the plan. For weeks they had turned the Kursk front into a fortress, minefields, trenches, bunkers, and thousands of hidden guns. As the panzers advanced, the ground erupted. Mines tore through their formations. Soviet artillery thundered from every direction. T-34 tanks emerged from the haze to meet them head-on. The fields of Kursk became a blazing inferno of steel, smoke, and fury. The Germans pressed forward with everything they had, but the Soviets would not yield. The steppe burned, the sky darkened, and the greatest tank battle in history was only just beginning. WWII, the summer of 1943. The Battle of Kursk had raged for days. Thousands of tanks burned across the steppe, the air thick with smoke and dust. The German advance was slowing, their momentum fading against the unbreakable wall of Soviet defense. Then came July 12th, the day of Prokhorovka. On that morning, more than 2,500 tanks clashed in a single, furious engagement. Tigers and Panthers against waves of Soviet T-34s charging at full speed. The ground shook beneath the weight of steel. Cannon fire echoed like thunder. In that chaos, the fields turned into a storm of fire and metal. At point-blank range, tanks rammed each other. Flames rose high into the sky. It was war at its most brutal. No retreat, no mercy, only survival. By nightfall, the fields around Prokhorovka were littered with the wreckage of both armies, but the German offensive was broken. Within weeks, the Red Army launched its own counterattack. The Germans, exhausted and bloodied, fell back, never again to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Kursk had ended Hitler's last hope of victory in the East. From that moment on, the tide of the war turned. The Red Army pushed westward, toward Berlin, toward victory. The steppe that once shimmered with gold and green was now silent again. But its soil would forever remember the roar of engines, the clash of steel, and the courage of those who fought there. By mid-July 1943, the thunder of battle still echoed across the Russian steppe. The once peaceful fields were now a wasteland of wrecked tanks, scorched earth, and smoke rising into the summer sky. The German offensive in Operation Citadel was faltering. Their advance had slowed to a crawl, and Soviet resistance grew stronger by the hour. Then came July 12th, near the small village of Prokhorovka, where history reached its breaking point. Over 2,500 tanks clashed in one of the most intense armored battles ever fought. Soviet T-34s charged headlong into German Tigers and Panthers, closing the distance until the fight became hand-to-hand, steel against steel. Engines roared. Guns blazed. The steppe trembled under the weight of war. In the chaos, the battlefield became a sea of fire and destruction, but through that storm the Soviet line held, unbroken, unyielding. By nightfall, the German attack had been stopped cold. Their last great offensive in the east was over. Kursk marked the turning point. From this moment on, the Red Army would never stop advancing. The battlefields of Kursk, once green and golden, were now silent. But beneath that silence lay the story of courage, sacrifice, and the moment the tide of World War II began to turn. When the guns finally fell silent over Kursk, the smoke lingered for days. The once lush fields of the Russian steppe were blackened, filled with the twisted remains of over 6,000 tanks, shattered guns, and the echoes of men who had fought to the very end. For the German army, Kursk was more than a defeat. It was the breaking point. Their dream of regaining the Eastern Front was gone forever. Operation Citadel had consumed their best tanks, their best men, their last hope for victory in the East. From that moment, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive on Soviet soil. For the Soviets, Kursk was a victory born of endurance and preparation. They had stood their ground against the most powerful armored force on Earth, and won. It was proof that the Red Army had become unstoppable. In the months that followed, Soviet forces pushed west, liberating Orel, Kharkov, and Smolensk. Every mile gained was bought with blood, but with each step they moved closer to Berlin. The Battle of Kursk had changed everything. It marked the end of Germany's dominance and the beginning of the Soviet advance that would end in the ruins of the Reich itself. The steppe that once burned with war now lay silent beneath the setting sun. But in that silence, history whispered of courage, sacrifice, and the turning of the tide in the greatest war the world had ever known.